Our lectures this academic year, and I won't read the title of the lecture because you can all read it yourself, but some of you may not know who Nigel Seeley was. He was head of the Department of Conservation here at UCL, the Institute of Archaeology, for many years, before going on to be the head of conservation at the National Trust, but stayed connected with us for most of his career and was very supportive when we set up in 2001 the Centre for Sustainable Heritage, that is now the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. And we hold these lectures in his name, in memory of him, who was a great supporter in the early years of cross-disciplinary research, which is something that we set out to do and continue to do to this day. I'd like to briefly introduce Dr. Adam Cooper. He is a lecturer in applied interdisciplinary social science at the UCL Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, with 10 years direct experience of the United Kingdom Public Service. His focus is on the use of technical advice for policy and developing new methods for applied socio-physical research. Prior to joining UCL, he was the head of social science engagement at the UK Government Department of Energy and Climate Change from 2011. And between 2006 and 2011, Adam was the head of research at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, where he led the Culture and Sport Evidence Programme, a 3-year, £1.8 million interdisciplinary strategic programme of research and analysis aimed directly at informing cultural policy. He joined the UK Public Service in 2002, working first in the area of child poverty and the children's social care workforce. He started his career as an academic in 1999 at the University of Birmingham, specialising in cognitive neuropsychology, where he published several peer-reviewed papers. Before I invite Adam to deliver his lecture, I'd like to remind you all that there will be question and answers opportunities after Adam finishes speaking, and then of course there will be drinks and networking opportunities afterwards. So I invite you to stay on also for those. Adam.
Thank you, May, and thank you everybody for coming out. It's great to see a sort of full house. I was worried that it was going to be a bit sort of rainy and might sort of put you off, but maybe the riff on Oscar Wilde and Woody Allen helped to sort of entice you into this evening. But I hope I haven't sort of over-egged my expectations for you in terms of the amount of excitement that you might get from it. But hopefully it should be interesting. I really want to thank May for inviting me to give this talk. I was initially a little bit kind of reluctant because, as you kind of saw from my bio, I've been out of cultural policy for a little while, so I feel a bit like this right now, like I'm walking on a high wire. And one side I could fall down because there's obviously lots of eminent cultural and heritage policy researchers in the audience who will just look at me and go, well, obviously you're out of date, or that was a crazy thing to say. And on the other side, general members of the public, wider interest, interdisciplinary people who I might speak to in a kind of strange foreign language called policy-ese or civil service-ese, and I try to sort of avoid that. But if there's anything kind of like completely sort of weird that I appear to have said, please do sort of raise your hand or ask me at the end. At the same time, the cover of this book kind of gives me some sense of credibility. So I'm, as May said, I'm a social scientist, and mass observation is sort of a really kind of creative movement that took off the pre-war period to sort of observe society. And I love the idea of being a scientist for the science of ourselves, and I think that's a sort of really relevant sort of perspective that I want to take tonight. So, and obviously, the sort of the sense of kind of heritage and history of the social sciences embodied in a penguin cover seems quite appropriate. So, what am I going to cover? So, here's the sort of teaser. First of all, why would policy making want to value heritage? There's a sort of first kind of question we'll look at. Common approaches to valuing heritage in that context. The case programme, which is, I think I teased in the abstract or the summary, the talk. It's in my bio. And then a little bit about some thoughts and reflections on that. Now I've kind of left it, if you like, behind. But I have such an interest in a job sense. I'm no longer head of research like at DCMS, so I can reflect on it from a bit of distance on the case programme. But kind of fundamentally, I suppose, underpinning all this is really the question of essentially, what is it to make heritage sustainable in a sort of ongoing societal sort of sense? And if we think of sort of policy as this way in which heritage can be reproduced within society, then understanding how the choices are made in policy can contribute to that. That's my angle, if you like, on the sustainable side of things. But happy to sort of pick that up later. So, policy. What is the challenge of policy? Some of you this might seem fairly sort of straightforward. Others it might be a revelation. I don't know. So, there are people like yourselves, like ourselves, society, Britain, maybe in this instance, and they get taxed. We all get taxed, and a bunch of money gets taken out of our income in various different ways. That then gets channeled via the Treasury and its various spending reviews towards different government departments. The Treasury has a very specific role in determining the ways in which departments get money, and the departments have to make cases about why they should have certain amounts of money in order to do certain things. Then once the department has its money, what it does is it turns to the what I call the policy analysis sausage making machine, and it pops the resources in there, cranks the handle, and out pops a policy sausage, or in the current case really a bit of heritage policy, right? So that could be like an institution like English Heritage, or it could be a building or some other kind of intervention in some senses, right? But then the idea is it doesn't really stop there, because in an evaluation or evaluation sense, these activities are supposed to return welfare back into society, with the idea, of course, that the welfare that you've gained by going through the system is greater than the welfare individuals would have got if they kept the money for themselves and spent it on cakes and donuts and coffee and whatever else people spend money on, right? Or we could think actually maybe it's more well-being, which is what I'm going to sort of hint at, or at least rather talk to specifically as we go. So hopefully that's the context in which I'm talking at the moment. National policy level making, Department of Culture, Medial and Sport, that kind of level. And I'm going to focus really on this bottom part of the diagram overall, the sort of sausage making machine, if you like, and the notions of value that are embodied within that context. So here's my sort of cartoon skeleton picture of heritage policy in the UK, which, as I say, as I walk on my very tight, very high wire, could be a little bit too sketchy, but hopefully it's broadly right. There is still a culture department currently, and it's sort of historically created English Heritage now, more recently Historic England. The ties have been cut in an institutional sense with English Heritage, which is now a sort of charity, and it's been given a bit of funding to sort of pick up some backlog work and stand on its own 2 feet ultimately over the next sort of, I think it's about 10 years or 5 years or so. Historic England has picked up some part of its portfolio and continues to be funded from DCMS. And then the other route really is through the National Lottery, which creates the Heritage Lottery Fund, which then uses money to promote heritage. Now, of course, what I'm talking about here, for those of you who are students of heritage policy, is what Laura Jane Smith, eminent sort of heritage policy researcher, has called the Authorized Heritage Discourse. This is really what I call the kind of narrow definition of heritage, which is sort of embodied, if you like, through these policy instruments described below. So let's just have a look at that. Let's just keep that in mind and just follow it through, and you'll kind of hopefully it'll make sense in terms of what I'm trying to convey. So when you look at the general approaches, the general idea of what they're trying to do as institutions, there's a kind of conservation of stuff, physical things, buildings, materials, these kind of things, but also maybe behaviours or activities in some sense. And there's also promoting heritage appreciation more broadly outside of the sort of direct sector, if you like. That's when you read their strategies and their aims, this is kind of broadly what you get out of it. The kind of money that they sort of put into doing those kinds of activities, English Heritage about 120 million a year, in Historic England roughly 175 million, Heritage Lottery Fund 375 million. These are the sorts of spending sort of levels. Okay, it's different ways of cutting the cake. This is how I've got my cake. And if you patch it all together, you get 670 million a year, which is not an insignificant sum of money. It's roughly, to get a bit of scale, about a third of the total of DCMS's spending in a year. Obviously, this isn't DCMS spending, there's a kind of range of different sources of funding here, but just to give you that scale. But also, of course, it's a very tiny fraction of overall public spending in the general context of government policy. It might be something like a single hospital in health, that kind of thing. But it gives you some sort of sense of scale. Either way, the exact number doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is a number, there is money, it's being spent, and we need to understand really what's happening to it. So the money is there, as we've seen, there's a sausage machine, and it creates value. Now the question is really, what is value? Is value a word written in Arial font without sans serif? I mean, what is that? It's just a sort of conceptual description of value. It's some kind of weird thing that's kind of important in economic analysis, but it's clearly not the money, because the money's there and you can see it. It's something else, and it's something that we all kind of care about, but what is it exactly? Okay. So then the question is really, how do we take this kind of concrete sort of thing of money and equate it or weigh it up in some sense against value of heritage in this instance? So that's the nature of the challenge that I'm trying to face. Now, there's a particular angle on this that makes it very pertinent and drives certain ways of thinking within policy making. Okay. Because value can be created in policy making through a range of different avenues, right? You've got, investment in business. What if, you took that 675 million and put it into some kind of business investment strategy through the Department of Business? What about education? When you put it there, you'll create value in other ways. And of course, both of these sectors have very advanced, very sort of data-driven, very economically mature, if you like, or at least extensive models of analysis that derive pound signs in GDP, GDA, and so on and so forth. Of course, the choice is culture alongside here. So the question is, well, okay, how are you going to compete? How are you going to sort of compete in some sense? And indeed, the question might be, should you compete? But I'll perhaps come back to that. So this is where the CASE programme comes in. So the CASE programme is the Culture and Sport Evidence Programme, as May said. And it was something that was derived back in the day. For those of you who are students of government and public policy logos, I don't know if there's anyone in who studies logos, there must be a PhD there somewhere. You'll notice that this is in itself a bit of policy heritage. So we can see, for instance, the DCMS logo looking very New Labour. You can see that there's a logo here for MLA, which is now over here and embedded in probably some of the letters of the Arts Council. English Heritage has changed its status, and I don't know if nowadays it would have been English Heritage or Historic England, or who would have been in that space. But that was the lie of the land at the time. And it was a 3-year programme initially, started in around 2008 and continued through its initial incarnation around to 2010, and that's the period I'm going to be talking about. So you can feel the altitude of my high wire as a sort of distance. We're now at 5 years hence from that, and there may well be that the world has changed in some significant way that may change even what I might want to say. But notwithstanding, what I am going to talk about is one of the significant projects that we undertook, the main project, if you like, underneath this. There are a number of things, and you can still find it, still alive. I mean, if you Google CASE DCMS, it will take you to the gov.uk website with this material. And interestingly, it doesn't have a banner that says National Archive, nor does it have a banner saying done under the coalition government, which means that it's still live and it's still sort of relevant in a sort of DCMS sense. So that was nice to see, and there's lots of resources on there on different types of research materials, different types of analytic materials, and so on and so forth. But I'm going to talk about one of the projects, the main projects, that we called Understanding the Drivers, Value and Impact of Engagement in Culture and Sport, and of course it cuts across all these areas. And we kind of split it up into those 3 domains, drivers, value and impact, because that kind of emerged as a sort of a tripartite division of the policy logic, if you like, or a sort of academic sense is the ontology of policy. Because essentially what you're trying to do with policies, you've got an instrument, and it's going, what's the point of doing that? What's it going to do? What's its impact? So you need to understand how your policy is going to change the world, right? And will it change the world? If it does change the world in some way, you need to know the value of that change, because that tells you the intensity of your action. How much action should you take in order to get that impact? And then the drivers are, well, if you know how much effort to make for that impact, how do you actually get that impact? What are the drivers for it? What are the actions and conditions that you need in order to achieve that kind of change, right? So that was a sort of drivers, value, impact framing. But I'm going to talk about value, the value bit of it, okay? And this was some standalone reports. Each of the areas has its own standalone report. And so there was an understanding the value of engagement in culture and sport, and here's the sort of the front piece there, the document. You download it, had I thought a very nice kind of logo and all the kind of things that you wouldn't get these days on policy documents for various cuts and whatever else. But that's where I'm going to focus. And this research carried out through commissioned research through Matrix Knowledge Group. It's worth, I need to mention their names, and the Institute of Education's Epicenter, who carried out an associated systematic review in this area, did the research. And they first of all reviewed standard approaches to valuing culture and sport, and of course heritage within that. And then we explored collectively new ways of doing it. Okay, here's how it's been done, not satisfactory, missing significant chunks, what's the new way of doing it? So let's have a look at the review. So what kinds of approaches are there to valuing heritage? So the top level kinds of ways are things that economists will talk about: spillovers, multipliers, gross value added, GDP type of things that involve jobs created. You know, if you create a new theatre, then there's 100 jobs there, and then there's a new cafe, and then you get coffee, and all this kind of spillover and knock-on kind of multiplier effects. Then there's the tourist dollar. Well, you know, we're getting an extra 100,000 people, and we're spending blah-de-blah money, and it therefore adds 6 billion to the economy, etc. And then there's regeneration effects, you know, the Bilbao kind of Guggenheim sort of idea. And this is the sort of thing that, for instance, the NMDC took this kind of approach in their Valuing Museums approach in 2006. And it's got merit, right? I mean, it's worthwhile picking these things up. I'm not saying this has no value. It definitely has some value, it has some use. But the point is, you know, to what extent do we stop there, or to what extent is that a main approach? And of course, you know, one can question the very nature of, you know, are museums there to create jobs? I think the answer to that is probably no. I hope it's no. It's to do something else, but they also happen to create jobs. It's a kind of co-benefit, if you like, in a policy wonk kind of word. And it's kind of missing the sort of fundamentals of it, is the take home. But the kind of things that they tend to say from this is like, for instance, you know, for every pound invested in heritage, £2.40 is returned to the economy. I need to make clear that's not a real factoid. I just made it up for illustration, so, you know, please don't anyone go out there and try to alter a report saying, I went to UCL and they said that every pound invested, blah, blah, you know. So I just sort of illustrate that. It's the kind of thing you'll see in the art sector, these kinds of things. And I guess one of the problems with this kind of approach is that you know, there are other industries out there that are much better at creating GVA and multipliers and industrial jobs impacts, this kind of thing. And so it's a kind of question, you know, to what extent should this be the first port of call, really, for this kind of analysis? That's the sort of kind of the discontent. And of course, when I was working with economists, I'm not an economist myself, working with economists, they'd look at this and they'd kind of have a bit of a scant look at it and sort of say, this isn't this is not the point of heritage. This is, you know, there's got to be another way of doing it. So what you find is, if you look further into different approaches, there's an approach called continued valuation, which economists call it continued valuation. Other social scientists might call it kind of analysing data with some pound signs, or asking people about value. So the first instance is what's called revealed preferences. So you might look at some house price data in the local area of some sort of heritage or park or some sort of theatre, and you might make the logic that if people value that amenity in some particular kind of way, then they're willing to pay more money for their house in order to be close to it, and therefore the difference in the value of their houses close to that amenity is equivalent to the value of that amenity. That's the sort of logic of it, and you can do, you know, analyses on this, and it does show this kind of, often shows these house price gains. And in some respects, it's got a lot of going for it because it's quite implicit within society. People aren't sort of consciously making those kinds of choices necessarily, or they're making kind of related choices, and it's kind of emergent rather than being, if you like, constructed. Compared to the next one, which is express preferences, this is where, well, you might go out and ask people for something that doesn't have, both of these really are kind of used where you don't have a market value, you don't have a price on it, there's no entrance fee, there's no direct sort of cost to the individual, so you want to find out the value to the individual. And so you might ask people, well, how much would you be willing to pay to go to this park that's free, or how much would you be willing to pay to have the cathedral restored to a certain level, and so on and so forth. And there's other ways of doing it that are a bit more sort of subtle and direct kind of questioning, which of course raises all sorts of, if you like, social survey type problems. But nevertheless, the willingness to pay one is quite a sort of topical one at the moment. So the Measuring Economic Value of Culture, Cultural Institutions, I should say, report that this is an AHRC funded project carried out with Nesta and a couple of private sector institutions and public sector ones, looked at using willingness to pay, using sort of modulated variance on it, as we're comparing it with well-being analysis. This was only published, I think, 3 weeks ago. So it seems to be sort of still quite a relevant kind of idea. So let's have a look at willingness to pay, these kinds of studies, and looking at heritage in particular. So in the report, what we did is we looked at, okay, let's look at all these kind of studies. What do we find? So if you look across the kind of the standard domains of cultural policy, you find that heritage comes out by some distance the biggest user of willingness to pay type studies, something approaching nearly 3 times the amount of studies, or the amount of data at least, so that might be sort of multiple data points within a study, compared to, say, even sport and museums. And this might be something to do with the nature of heritage, so there's lots of historic buildings which you can appreciate just by being in the street and so on and so forth, so there's kind of challenges in that space, again within this narrow definition of heritage, which maybe don't apply so much in these other kinds of sectors where there are specific buildings that have entrances and blah, blah, blah. So the other way to cut it is to look at different types of engagement. So in the case program, we sort of created a classification of forms of engagement: watching, doing, attending, visiting, even notions of non-use, which I'll come to in a moment, membership, decision-making, etc., etc. And then you can look at the valuation approaches in there. So visiting a heritage site, for instance, is, because we've seen so many of them, both market and non-market valuation studies, lots of them. Non-use of heritage, this idea that what's out there, and I'd be quite willing to pay for it to be maintained. I might never go to Stonehenge, but I'm happy for 50p of my income every year or so to go towards its maintenance, because I like the idea of it being there. It's the concept of non-use. Enacting heritage, which when at the time I kind of understood was a bit of a Cinderella area of heritage, the idea of people gathering together and sort of enacting different kinds of heritage, has no evaluation studies on it at all. But it just kind of shows the lay of the land. Now, of course, so there's been lots of willingness to pay studies in there, but there's also been noted lots of problems with willingness to pay. So there's lack of coherent fixed preferences. This idea that you can ask someone, you kind of gain special access to this value that they're holding in their head, and they just kind of deposit it in the survey, is a bit of a falsehood. There's lots of psychological evidence to suggest that the values that are sort of derived through that are constructed on the fly. It's a sort of heuristics that might be used. Well, this is similar to going to the cinema or something else. Therefore, it must be about £6.50 or £2.40, depending where your cinema is, I suppose, and so on. So you're not really getting the value of that. You're getting at tactics or psychological approaches for answering the question. The other issue is question marks over the validity of the estimates. I mean, not just based on the kind of this constructed thing, but the huge range in variances that you get with willingness to pay studies. And that might be a function of the lack of a systematic way of conducting willingness to pay studies between different areas. So, it might be okay with one particular area and run one location, but when you're trying to sort of make generalisations, it just doesn't work. It doesn't function, of course. At a national policy-making level, that's particularly tricky. And of course, allied to that is this idea that it's not transferable to insight. So if you do a willingness to pay study on a monument, how does that relate to willingness to pay to engage in some sort of history, storytelling activity? They're quite different in different areas, different times, different people, and so on. So making this idea a general sort of value, if you like, of heritage is quite difficult. So, and of course, underpinning all this is just kind of the question of how relevant are these approaches to heritage outcomes. And outcomes there is actually a kind of policy way of talking about the point of heritage. You know, what is it? What is it about? What is heritage? What does it mean in a sort of human sense, rather than, if you like, a policy sense? And I'll return to that towards the end. But I'm going to stick with the idea of heritage and that kind of, as I mentioned it earlier, the kind of authorized discourse, the kind of heritage as you know it, through sort of English heritage kind of lens. And look at what we did through case to approach and address these kind of problems. Okay? So what we did was we landed on subjective well-being analysis. Okay? So subjective well-being analysis derives from asking people different types of questions. Questions like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life overall right now? Okay? And you know, it's a different sort of question. It's a life satisfaction question. It's happened, you know, it's emergent in lots of different areas, and there's lots of research about how it relates to people's psychological well-being more broadly. And so it's, you know, it's had some validation done on it. Anyway, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So I just wanted to hold that in mind, and we can, you know, potentially unpick it later if you think it's important. And then what you do is you ask thousands of people, or you know, large numbers of people, that kind of question, and you also ask them questions about things they do in their lives, right? So how often do you engage in heritage? Sort of, you know, conceptual type question. You might ask people, and you look at associations between that life event and their patterns of reporting well-being. You know, with the underlying logic that, you know, if you're a heritage sort of proponent in a sense, you'd want to see higher levels of well-being for people who do heritage more often. That's the sort of underpinning argument. So why would you want to do this? Why subjective well-being? Well, you know, I guess the argument we're making to ourselves at the time, and I think it has some strength to it still, is that culture and heritage are about kind of quality of life. It's about, you know, about the nature of living well. It's about a richness in a broad sense. So if that's true, and of course, in a sort of face-valid sort of way, subjective well-being ought to be kind of detectable through that, right? So having an enriched life should mean that you're more satisfied with your life. I mean, it just has a kind of direct kind of logic to it. And importantly, there is available data on these kinds of things. So, you know, it's quite useful to be able to come up with a concept and use one that is actually functionally useful within a policy setting. So the question is then, what kind of data do you need to use this analysis in policy? Well, at the national level, you need population level data. You need a big survey, basically. This will be representative and gives it a strength and like a technical power that means that when you're presenting that kind of information to the Treasury, you're saying, well, look, this wasn't just 5 people that we asked. This was a random probability sample of the population, blah, 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 this kind of thing. All of which kind of gives a kind of, you know, credible heuristic to saying, actually, this is good stuff and we trust it and therefore you have it. That's a kind of cartoon measure. Obviously, we have to have measures of heritage engagement in some sense, and we can sort of, you know, talk about that a little bit. Obviously, has to have big measures of well-being, and we sort of know they exist out there. Preferably longitudinal. And I'll come back to what that means in a moment, because longitudinal data enables you to make much stronger causal arguments, and create causal evidence, which is obviously important if you're trying to say, you know, investing in this causes that. Right? That's the sort of the underlying logic. And it's also important for analytic and other kinds of reasons to have data on people's background, income, etc., and so on. And we'll sort of see how that plays out. So why longitudinal data, and what is it? Obviously, for those of you who are not sort of baptized in the world of surveys. So essentially, longitudinal data is where you go out and you ask repeatedly, you know, similar questions or the same questions of the same person time after time. So we've got a happy smiley face, you're obviously very pleased to be interviewed, and it goes through. We've done it 5 times, and we've asked similar sorts of questions. Now, the alternative is a cross-sectional survey where you might ask the same questions of different people each time. Okay, so you ask the same questions, but each time it's a completely different set of people. And you might ask the same sort of questions of them. So you might ask them about heritage engagement. You might ask them about subjective well-being. And if we focus on the top for the moment, we might see a pattern of whether they've engaged in previous amount of time in the amount of heritage in some sense. And they might say yes, no, 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 yes, no. And then they might also report this level of subjective well-being, okay, which looks all very well and nice. But the trick with longitudinal, and this is kind of why it adds that kind of causal factor to it, is that the underlying logic is that if you've engaged in culture and there's a causal relationship with it being kind of, you know, improving your life, then subsequently, after you've done that engagement, you should feel better, right? So there's all temporal arrangements of these kinds of phenomena. So that means that if you've engaged, then subsequently your subjective well-being should be higher, is the theory, okay? So you're looking diagonally down and across those two kinds of questions in their data. And then, usefully, because you've asked subjective well-being at the same point each time, you can look back and calculate the change. And of course, so you can see it's increased, decreased, increased, and then you can relate that to their levels of engagement, okay? So here, obviously, I've constructed a nice positive example where engaging in heritage is clearly associated with positive subjective well-being gains, and when you don't do it, you feel a bit sad. And so that's the sort of idea. And of course, you know, it's intrinsically sensible and logical to be able to make that kind of link because it's the same person through time. You know, it's their life, it's their trajectory through time. With cross-sectional, you can't do that. You simply can't do it. It doesn't make any sense to sort of start looking across waves and sort of, you know, making that kind of argument. You can only look internally. So if you're asking the question, you know, imagine this is like, you know, it's a Tuesday evening. You know, the interviewers come around. They've asked you at you know, time. You know, the third question is their subjective well-being. The 15th question is how do you engage with heritage. You've really no notion if they've engaged in heritage because they're really happy, or they're really happy and because they're happy they went out and did some heritage. Right? You don't know if happy people do heritage or heritage makes you happy. It's just an association. And so it doesn't give you that kind of potential for causal analysis. So that's why we were so keen to try and get longitudinal data. Hopefully that's clear for everyone. So what data is there out there? So some of you may know about a huge survey called Understanding Society, which, you know, I mean, it pretty much almost lives up to its name, if it's possible within a survey. It's a survey now of 40,000 households, 100,000 individuals across the UK, and it's been going since its previous incarnation, the British Household Panel Survey, since the early 90s. The other survey that's really pertinent in this space is Taking Part, which is a large, or at least it was quite a large survey from DC, that was funded through DCMS. On cultural participation, more broadly cultural and sport participation. So those are sort of two principal sort of data sources, national level, very powerful. Importantly for understanding society, as you can see in its name, it's longitudinal. That's obviously pretty critical. We really wanted to make sure we had that. It's got measures of sports, cinema and theatre going. It doesn't have heritage. Bit of a pain. It's got measures of subjective well-being. Great, thumbs up, that's really useful. And it also has this data on people's background that we were saying before is really useful. I'll come back to how that's useful in a minute. So it's got all those things. It's got 3 out of 4. That's pretty good going, actually. And there's even some, you know, getting close to heritage stuff there, right? Theatres, sport is heritage. Yeah. Anyway, we can look at that in a minute. Taking Part, on the other hand, of course, it's cross-sectional. So it's again, there's different people each year. It doesn't really give you that. I know it's kind of moving towards, or it may have even moved into having a longitudinal subsample. I was speaking to the person who used to manage it the other week, and they were talking about it moving, having a longitudinal element to it. But by and large, at the time, and certainly at the time, it was only cross-section. It has, of course, detailed measures of heritage, albeit the narrow definition in the policy sense, but very detailed, very broken down into different kinds of heritage measures, and it also has data on people's backgrounds. So, the problem we face is that neither survey has everything. Okay, that's the problem. But the solution is, we'll just add them together. Sounds kind of simple. And if you do some very nice statistical ninjutsu, what you can do is take the fact that you know that people who attend heritage have a certain kind of background properties, right? So if they have a certain sort of background properties, maybe we can predict in the other survey on those background properties the likelihood of attending heritage sites. Bear with me, stay with me. So what we do is we sort of create a predicted measure in the other survey and sort of say, okay, this predicted measure is kind of predicted engagement in heritage. And when you predict engagement in heritage, we can look at the subjective well-being associated with those predicted engagements. Okay? And of course what you need here is data that's kind of dynamic, right, that can change over time. There's no point in having background data that's like gender, because of course it doesn't change. Well, mostly it doesn't change, I suppose. But the point is things like, you know, money, income rather, job status, this kind of thing. Those kinds of dynamic measures enable you to sort of see over time whether it's gone up or down. Is the logic. So we've got this far. We've kind of scaffolded up our analysis. Where has it got us? So now hold your breaths here. This is impressive stuff. we were able to say predicted attendance at an historic building. We couldn't say at heritage more generally because heritage engagement generally is very high, it's something around 80%. And because it's so high, there's so little room for variance that we had to go for something that was much less high in terms of its engagement in order to give the space for the variance required to sort of pull out a pattern. So we had to go with historic buildings. Okay, so bear with us. Predicted attendance at historic buildings is associated with a nearly significant, not significant, but nearly significant increase in subjective well-being at the 20% level, which, you know, in most senses is not significant, but it was kind of, it looked quite close, we wanted to be optimistic. And if we take that as a kind of a finding, what we can say is that the scale of the change, because of course it's useful to try and sort of bring it out into comparative areas, so you can think in those kind of, you know, that value diagram, you know, the sort of ways of deriving value, that the gain, the scale of the gain is roughly twice the loss from unemployment, right? So going to heritage is sort of twice as good as kind of not losing your job, in a sense. So that was kind of where we got to. You can sort of read it, and essentially what we did was we followed the logic through of this kind of analysis and did the best we could. Now, of course, for other sort of measures, as you saw before, there was, you know, sports, cinema, theatre, actual measures in the survey, you can go further. You can convert the subjective well-being gains into pounds, right? Or you can do it through a bit more high-level statistical ninjutsu called income compensation technique. Okay. This is a sort of fairly novel technique that was developed almost in parallel with this work that we did there. This is one of the, we were the first, sort of, these semesters, the first department to try and deploy this in a public policy research piece. And it's subsequently actually become part of the Treasury's guidance on valuation as a kind of annex in there. It's a kind of variation on this method here. This is a kind of first pass at it. But essentially what you do is if you plot the income levels of people in the Understanding Society survey, and you plot their mean subjective well-being scores across the survey, you get a relationship roughly like this. Right? I'm not saying this is the actual one, this is just kind of smoothed out, it's kind of to illustrate the point. There's a kind of reasonable sort of, you know, relationship between subjective well-being and annual household income that gives you some sort of useful relationship between the two, right? So it means that you can take, for any particular level of subjective well-being score, you can trace down, obviously, the level of income. So if you get a change, if your subjective well-being goes up, you can trace across and see, well, what is that equivalent to in terms of the income level, right? So you get a sort of, okay, if you're going, your subjective well-being increases from 5.8 to 6.2 gain, that's actually equivalent to something around a £9,000 salary or household income increase. Okay, it's a way of converting it from a kind of this abstract notion, in a sense, this kind of non-monetary value of subjective well-being into a pound value. And there's a sort of superficial or even, you know, fairly logical reason for choosing household income as a kind of source for doing this, right? Because this is where the taxes are coming from. It kind of closes that circle that we saw before. So it's like, you know, it has a certain kind of reasonableness about it. But of course, when you dig into it more and more deeply, it creates certain kinds of problems. And I mean, one of the problems was this was a certain sort of figures. When you looked at the sports figure, the concert figures that we had from Understanding Society, you get something equivalent to this, the well-being gains are in the region of £9,000 to £10,000. And there's a whole other lecture there about what that did to the economists. They just thought it was just too big. I don't know how they judged that, but either way, that was the response. But overall, it gives you a kind of a way of getting at these kind of things, converting it. And and hopefully what I'm trying to get at is that you can see the reason why you get to this kind of thing. That's kind of what I want to get across. So, what are the lessons from this? So you might think, well, you know, hey, those sports, those cinema people, those theatre people, they did pretty well. Maybe there should be heritage questions on Understanding Society. That's the obvious first question. What do I think about that? I think, yeah, why not? You know, it's a great survey. It's useful to try and understand the patterns of people's lives. The next kind of question that sort of implies is it really that this method I've described should be developed? And that's where I start to get really, really uncomfortable. Because it feels like this. It feels like a kind of analytical house of cards. It's like we've stacked one thing on top of another, and we've abstracted again, and we've done this bit of, you know, high-level statistical ninjutsu. It's got higher, it's teaching, and it's getting further and further away from the whole point of heritage, right? This is just kind of mind-reading through statistics. It's a sort of, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Yeah, and I'm not saying that this is wrong for policy. I'm saying that actually, is this right for heritage? Is kind of the question. Because you follow this line down and you kind of hit the end of the road. And I mean, one of the issues that we face when you do this analysis is that there's no place for those figures to go. Right? You get this value of subjective well-being, and everybody goes, nah. So what? Right? That's not real money. It's not GDP. So who's going to do anything with that value? Is the kind of question. That's one of the problems. But the other problem is this kind of abstraction further and further away from heritage. And of course, heritage, when you think about it in a more kind of natural sense, in a broader sense, it's not about this kind of abstraction, this kind of averaging. It's about the distinction. It's about the identity. It's about the difference in some respects. Is the point. And so by trying to sort of add things up and abstract and sort of average, you kind of almost diametrically move away from the nature of what you're trying to measure, right? So really what I'm trying to say is that I think we need a much deeper reflection of what a wider understanding of heritage, moving away from, if you like, the AHD kind of model, might mean for public policy. Because I think if you do that, it has some profound implications. So that's where if you think of heritage as a kind of placeholder for the notion of identity, the notion of place identity, for the notion of communities, rooted histories, their sense of self, their sense of place, these kind of things, are kind of really important. Of course, what we can kind of see in that is heritage policy more as a kind of cultural identity policy, right? And then one starts to see, this being owned across governments, across both national and local, critical. And I put an exclamation mark there because just the sort of it kind of blows the mind of the external servant in me to think about how you might actually enact that. But what I kind of think it's not impossible, simply because from a kind of superficial engagement with presentations about how the French do their policy, it seems to be embedded a bit more, this sense of identity, cultural identity, within just other ordinary practices of policy making, not particularly heritage policy, but just town planning, it could be schools, it could be whatever. That's my sense, I don't know. So you guys might know a lot better than me on that. But so it seems to be possible, in the sense that there's a potential example out there. But quite how you make that happen, potentially what you need is a different kind of culture of policy making, I suppose, which is thinking about a different channel of ways of enacting value through this decision process that we're trying to get at. Because of course, fundamentally, the whole point of policy really is to make decisions about how we use our resources. And what we've done is we've kind of taken a generic approach to resources, which is tax, and then apply a generic analysis to get generic heritage. I mean, there's an oxymoron, right? So the question is, how do you make it more kind of heritagey, more specific, more identity-oriented, beyond this authorized heritage discourse? So my punt on this is maybe I'm on my high wire. Probably people have written books on this. I don't know, but I'm going to put my flag behind them if they have. Sort of a value that's based on more things like participatory decision making, local political debate and decisions about what we retain, what's important, where we spend our resources in that kind of way. And of course, that has a kind of resonance with the current administration's, at least sort of historic ideas about localism and so on, if one takes those things seriously. But the point is about something distinctive about heritage that means that if it just gets minced into the general national policy making process, it loses the very nature of what it is the feeling that I get. And the reason I think about this kind of participatory approaches is because I always think back to the Kevin McLeod and his Big Town Plan program. I don't know if any of you've seen it. It's still on Channel 4, you can still look at it. And it's based at Castlefield in Yorkshire. And the reason I quite like this is because there's a natural experiment that was done there, right? And as a social scientist, one might
set the scene. I think it's quite unsettling. The kind of messages are very unsettling on how, in policy terms, heritage is being framed, and how actually what we need is to reconfigure heritage and allow the voices of the people to speak. Yeah? So thank you all for coming, and I think you'll join me in thanking Adam for giving us a lot of food for thought. first floor, and I think there'll be people pointing you up stairs.
Sort of observe these natural experiments, and Castleford is it's a deprived town in the north, suffered lots of deprivation through closing down the mines, and it had some really profound underdeveloped areas that needed rejuvenation. And there were two areas in particular they looked at. One, where the plan was for a high-flying New York architect to come in and bang, do some amazing kind of bit of landscaping and say, hey, this is going to change your lives. Probably with a New York accent, God, whatever I did there. But the alternative was a kind of community architect's approach that engaged local people in the decisions about what to do in a particular play area, and they co-created this space. And so what you find in this local play area is that it basically got hammered by the community, but not destroyed because it was maintained, and they spent their resources, their time, maintaining it, looking after it, even when there was local youths who were setting fire, pulling out their header and whatever else. They cared about it and they owned it and it was theirs. And whereas the New York monument had grass growing out of the cracks and it wasn't maintained, right? And it's like, whoa, okay, so there's something that's telling us here, right? What's happened in this way? And you can watch the program, it's still on the Channel 4 Catch-Up website. This is how I captured the images from it. So essentially you've got a kind of bottom-up community-grown future heritage in a sense. This is a place of identity, this is a place where these points of significance are being created through this process. And one can see the value just generated by its use, by its being there, by its having a role in the community. Whereas this other place is a top-down, community-ignored future burden. This has got to be maintained, or we've got to take some community tax and cut the lawn, and no one really wants to use it. That was the sense that you got from people's perspective on this. It wasn't really what we wanted, but okay, it's there, and people need to make it look nice. So in the top sense, I would sort of say this is a kind of sustainable type of heritage, whereas this is more of an unsustainable heritage. It's not the kind of thing that we want. We're kind of signaling it my time up. That's a pretty hardcore way of making me finish. We're going to be taken out by the cops. So I managed to make it across my homework. Thank you so much for listening. That's my email address if you want to sort of send either thoughts, comments, abuse, whatever. And here's the web address. So this will all be online on the ICO website, so you can have these slides for the case program work, and you can see all the kind of resources around there. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Adam, and yes, it will be all on our website, so no abusive emails, please. We'll draw a line at that. Okay, anybody, questions? If I could ask you to say your name and affiliation as you ask the question, it just gives Adam the opportunity to focus his answer. Who's going to go first? Yes.
My name is Anna.
Could you raise your voice so people at the back can hear you, please?
My name is Anna. I started my PhD and I am a supervisor. And I'm actually, my background is in psychology as well. So, just being the devil's advocate, wouldn't you say that maybe heritage isn't meant for this capitalistic approach at all? Because there is this drive for productivity where it's a bit like working 80 hours per week until you get sick. And it just doesn't seem to make sense to me that we would evaluate it through the same, using the same principles that we would apply to the economy, because what happens then is even when you do engage the public decision making, it's still a bottom-up program, and so all this happening with citizen science, I would say 80% of that is still reaffirming the same status quo.
See what you're saying, yeah, so in a sense that if you create a participative approach, because the framework that people are participating within is this idea of jobs growth and so they're going to go to those kinds of places.
Yeah, I think that the idea of heritage institutions having those numbers in mind and having to get back to the government with the figures and not ever being able to get out of that loop.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm kind of agreeing with you. I think that we do need to get out of that loop, and the question is how. Because there is this pressure, and it's probably talking earlier on that it's even maybe more intense right now with a certain kind of approach that the Treasury might be taking, where it's very sort of economy focused. It's very kind of growth oriented.
This was actually my question. Shouldn't we make the decision that heritage does not belong to the areas that can be?
I think
I'm going to hold up on the supplementary questions so Adam can answer and then we can move on. Yeah, because there are plenty of hands in the air.
Sure.
Adam.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the kind of point that I'm making. I guess the challenge is how do you do that? If you want to separate out heritage into a distinct way of doing things, you have to break it free from the sort of not the main channels that drive policy for growth into policy for well-being, if you like, I suppose, and sort of say actually there is a distinct channel of activity here which has a different framework of operating, and the question is really how you do that in an operational sense from a civil service perspective is what interests me as well. But I kind of agree.
So my name's Oliver Smith. I'm an architect and urban designer, and I'm
Raise your voice, please.
Oliver Smith, architect and urban designer. My interest is so you presented this in terms of the DCMS and the funding of heritage, but there's a very interesting looking at it through the world of DCLG or even of the Treasury and the value of heritage under threat. I mean, and as the National Capital Committee looked at the value of a hectare of greenbelt or forestry, can we not use the kind of mechanism you explored as a way of valuing a block of buildings in a conservation area that are under risk of redevelopment because there is no real way of valuing the kind of identity and contribution to our heritage that those represent. They're valued as square feet of space, but less than the enormous tower that the developer wants to replace it with. But there's no offsetting value to them. It seems to me that what you have here is possibly a way of identifying that.
I mean, possibly. I suppose my concern is, I mean, it's a trade-off to some extent in terms of tactics. So there's a trade-off of taking an approach like this, which sort of tries to identify the kind of more closely the nature of the value of these things and turning it into pound value so that it fits neatly into an impact assessment for Treasury or CLG, versus by doing that kind of reinforcing the context and actually undermining over the long term other approaches that could be taken to maintaining the value of these things. So if there was a more participatory local decision-making approach, saying actually just want to keep that, help us keep that, this is really important to us. And by taking seriously that idea of a kind of local democracy, then you leverage that sense of value that is presumed to exist in the community. And of course, the point is that if the community doesn't value it, then the question is, should it remain? I suppose is the underlying point I'm making. And of course, but the point is that if there is a sense of identity in that area, then they will value it, and therefore they'll want to sort of position resources. But that takes a structural shift in the decision-making process.
Which leads to a supplementary question.
Which you'll hold for a minute because there's somebody behind you who wants to ask a question.
My name's Janet Miller, a company called Atkins. This is very useful. I think it's great to see it in the long history of trying to value heritage. Some of us have had a go as well. We did a project with National Trust about 10 years ago, and actually we tried to make a distinction between engaging in heritage and actually living with heritage, and I think there is a difference. And what we tried to look at was the instrumental benefits. If you lived in an old place, were you more likely to be better educated, were you perhaps more likely to be healthy, things like that. Very, very difficult. It was just pilot, and like you, we came out with conclusions which were quite difficult to quantify. The difficulty then, of course, is that then you start saying, well, we can't do it that way because you can't quantify it. Then you have to revert to the kind of motherhood and apple pie statements. And how wonderful heritage is for our lives and things. Start very, very quickly comes into motherhood and apple pie. And your lovely example about Castleford, that's great, but that's how urban designers think all the time. And they've been doing that for decades. So that's that participatory stuff is nothing new, as you say, in any kind of generating quality of life in our open spaces and stuff.
Mhm.
But what's interesting, 2 or 3 years ago, when this really got going in terms of valuing heritage again, because them also had a go,
Right.
similar conclusions, is that at the time of cuts to English heritage and places like that, actually the place where there weren't cuts in budget for the museums, and my observation was at that very time was the time of Neil McGregor's fantastic broadcast about 100, whatever, the world of history in 100 objects.
Yeah.
And for me, that was policy, because it needed no other explanation, and it went straight to government, and in my view, that's what saved funding to museums, that very one thing. So maybe we need to start looking at heritage much more in terms of the stuff itself.
Yeah.
Talk about the stuff itself.
Yeah.
Not in an instrumental benefit way, not in a valuing way, but the stuff itself, and that itself might lead on to policy
Yes.
in the way that Neil McGregor
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think I agree essentially with what you're saying, because but the question that I put my civil service hat on, and I kind of go, well, how would we do that?
Well, how did McGregor do it?
Well, the question is, I suppose, did McGregor sort of kind of leverage a kind of high level senior civil service kind of thing? And that's all very well for the high level city, but what about the small stuff, right? Where there is local areas that have a sense of identity that's being stripped away as we talk, right? I mean, things are being shut down, communities are being sort of blandified. Is kind of the argument that Neff have put, in terms of the
That's a value-laden statement.
well, no, but in terms of the high street becoming basically identical is the argument they made. And so the question is, to what extent does that kind of the value that local people place on the shape of their area get a voice, right? And then we're talking about, well, okay, yes, there are these kind of, I guess, business-led approaches of community engagement through urban planning and urban design, but structurally to build that in as a kind of mainstream way of doing it generally, and particularly for heritage, I suppose, is, I guess, the sort of the next step up. And that's, I suspect, quite a shift, because it's a totally different.
I think it's what, sorry, mate, just that it is worth unpicking this. When we're talking about heritage, we must make sure that we don't imply things which are up for debate. And one is that heritage is finite. That's up for debate, actually. One is that we don't create heritage every day. That's up for debate. It isn't heritage until only own. And actually, sometimes it's flipping blind, but it's not heritage.
Yeah.
So, that we've got to unpick that, that notion of heritage,
I
actually.
agree.
Any other questions? Yes.
Catherine, I want to lecture you. You made a comparison.
Voice. I think voice needs to be heard.
I'll lecture a voice now.
Yes.
Please be standing up for that.
Yeah.
Do it.
You made a comparison with education and education policy, and I mean, the same is quite true of education. Like, education is a really complicated thing, and the impact that education has on people's lives. Is that part of the argument for a different strategy for heritage, that really a different strategy ought to be taken for education, and that really quantifiable measures of measuring the impact of education policy can be harmful or oversimplified?
I think you're right. I mean,
Just a second. Have you all heard the question at the back? You've struggled. Could you just summarise it before you answer?
So the question was, I mentioned education is essentially the same issue in terms of trying to apply the standard economic sort of approach to evaluating education. Is that also kind of you could take the same approach as I suggested for heritage and sort of try and peel back kind of the idea of the economic value of education and treat it in a more heritage kind of way. I think that's true. I think because education gets drawn into a sort of fundamentally instrumental argument, right? It's like the reason we go to school is to get a job, right?
Yeah.
Why do we get a job? So you can produce things. What stuff? Well, stuff for the economy. Why? So that people can have jobs. And you get into this kind of, well, just a minute. My life is more than just having a job, right? And education is more than just having a job. And like heritage is more than just a building. It's a much more enriching experience. And I suppose the point is that when one creates this kind of alternative channel of evaluation, I think, I guess the point is I'm I'm still kind of thinking that you probably need the current model of kind of growth and economics. So I'm trying a chance to sort of try and dismantle that. But I think you do need you know, this alternative way to hold it in tension, to sort of make sure you've got a good balance, and I think it would apply, you know, in education and other areas as well.
I suppose it's kind of, is education a cautionary tale for heritage, that we're oversimplifying something very
Well, I think, I mean, the cautionary tale I was going to make was in housing, actually, because, I mean, in education, I don't know, I'm not deep enough into it, and it's not been high enough profile in terms of the nature of what's happened to education. If you know more, maybe someone does, maybe you know. But certainly in terms of housing, you know, we've seen the shift away from the home to the safety deposit box, essentially, right? And this idea of, you know, it's just about numbers, it's about value, and it's about blah, and losing this sense of what it's really about, what it's for, and why we care. I think is the important thing to keep in mind. And the point is that it does take a different kind of process for embodying that within the decision making.
Questions? Yes, at the back.
Janie Credit, object conservation. You mentioned the French. Apart from changing the whole of our national culture, are there any lessons we can learn from the French?
That's a very good question. One that I probably can't answer wholly at the moment, but what I do know about the French civil service system is that they have a very distinct way of training their civil servants compared to the UK approach. Now, I don't know the detail on that, I don't know how widespread that is, whether it's just for a particular kind of fast stream sort of civil service, but certainly there's something about, you know, the way that culture gets imbued through education. We're just kind of mentioning that, and this idea of what you should consider important, because, you know, fundamentally, you know, essentially, if you take the economic analysis, it's really just, here's your skills. Your skills are to fill in a CBA, a cost-benefit analysis, in this impact assessment, and if you do it right, you'll get promoted. Now, if you change those kinds of things, you say, well, your skills now are to think about this broader blah blah type of things, then you get a different kind of outcome. I mean, the challenge is that it's obviously a very big and deep sort of thing, but obviously if you try to take it seriously and the government comes in with that kind of idea, then there's a potential for it. But I think my point is really is to look to other places where culture plays a stronger role in policy making in a kind of more broad sense. Look at that and see what can we learn. What is transfer? What is the English version of the French approach?
What was the point of the case programme?
The point of the case programme was to try and shore up the perceived lack of evidence underpinning cultural policy.
Who was asking for the evidence?
So the evidence was being asked for, so there was a number of drivers at the point at which it was created. The permanent secretary at the time, Jonathan Stevens, had just had a capability review, which is basically a kind of like a kind of peer review or kind of ref of the ability of the department to make policy. And one of the weaknesses was seeing the amount of evidence underpinning policy and the ability to use that evidence. So there was a driver there. There was a driver coming from the science elements within government, Go Science as it is now, an Office for Science, saying you're not using science, you don't have a chief scientist, these kind of things. And there was a general sense that we were losing out, the arguments were being lost because of this idea of, oh, it's great, you know, well, that doesn't cut it, because education's great, health is great, we're all great, right? I mean, there's no way of distinguishing. And so to try and make the arguments in more of a kind of way that fitted within, if you like, the heuristics and the notions that Treasury expected.
But we know that policy is not a closed loop. There's policy, and then there are politicians.
Yeah.
So to what extent did ministers use the evidence in making policy?
Well, that's a $64 million question, isn't it?
I don't want you to dig up the corpses, but if you could just give us an idea.
Well, I mean, I suspect, we at the time, just after we'd done a lot of the work on the case programme, there was I think there was a spending review, and it was at that point that we'd be getting kind of briefings to say, well, what's the evidence for the impact of the arts on health, kind of things, and we'd use these kind of resources to generate, well, we know from these kinds of bits of research that if you have these kind of programs, then all the people go along, and you can then calculate the costs and sort of the effect on the health service and so on and so forth. So then, the minister at that kind of point would be just looking to his civil servants to be able to answer that question on its own terms, so that he or she could maintain that sense of, yes, I know what's happening, I can speak legitimately and credibly to this kind of thing, as long as obviously it provided a source of credibility within the context they were being asked those questions. Now, the extent to which the kind of, I guess, the other parallel approach of policy making, which is that kind of peer-to-peer negotiation between the Treasury, between other senior ministers and cabinet, sort of that trade-off of, well, okay, I'll cut the funding on libraries if you'll leave the arts sector alone. That, you know, we're not privy to as civil servants. And so the extent to which any kind of, well, what's the evidence for cutting libraries? You know, this kind of negligible. It's only when you get kind of a review, you know, let's look at libraries, what's the evidence that they're really good, sort of thing. Okay, here we get to sort of throw it up and then put it on the table. So when, you know, I think Margaret Hodge initiated a review of libraries at the time, and that the evidence kind of surfaced through that side of things. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole dark matter area in the politics.
Okay, any final question before we... Yes, please. Your name and affiliation, please.
I'm Sophia, I'm an architectural conservation. Just one question about these indicators. Is there any research on place attachment, on the importance of sense of place, or any indicator that really indicates how people value things?
There is, I mean, I do know of a study in my head, and I was actually trying to find it so that I could reference it on this, but it was done up in the northeast, I think, by Durham University. I think it was Durham University, I can try and dig it out, it might have been Newcastle, where they looked at the role of sense of place and the value in and around the area of Durham or the northeast or some sort of area. So people...
Having set the scene, I think it's quite unsettling, you know, the kind of messages are very unsettling on how, in policy terms, heritage is being framed, and how actually what we need is to reconfigure heritage and allow the voices of the people to speak. Yeah? So thank you all for coming, and I think you'll join me in thanking Adam for giving us a lot of food for thought. Okay, so those of you who want to join us, it's on the first floor, and I think there'll be people pointing you up stairs.